Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back in another episode of Weight of the Underhive. This series is dedicated to helping brand new players to Necromunda build their starting rosters and learn more about the game mechanics of their favorite gangs. And on today's episode, we will discuss the basics of gang composition for your games of Necromunda in the 2024 year. We will discuss the roles that your fighters will fulfill, the purpose of the different fire teams and how to use them, and provide more critical information to help you to dominate in your next campaign of Necromunda. So right off the bat, happy 2024. We're starting a brand new year, and because of that, with this whole new idea of creating a brand new year, if there's any new players out there who are struggling to get the basics of Necromunda, how to build their gangs, etc., well, this video is designed for you. This whole video, of course, is to show you tips, tricks, and hacks to help you dominate in the wastelands of Necromunda for the year 2024 by showing the very basics of how to organize your gang and how to best to use elements of your gang to be successful in your games in Necromunda. So if you're a hive scummer who's tired of working in the manufactoriums as well as factors in Necromunda, and you're thinking about picking up your stub gun and maul and joining up a gang, well, this video is for you, and let's talk about exactly how you're able to dominate with gang compositions. Now, because this video will be a little bit more of a deeper dive, I will put timestamps in the description box down below so that way you can click and navigate to the part of the video that interests you the most. So in this video, we'll be addressing three basic different things. First of all, we're going to talk about the very basics of gang composition. That is pretty much how you design to organize your gangs and what to fill them with. The second thing we're going to talk about, of course, is how to divide your gang into smaller elements called fire teams. We'll discuss what those are and what purposes those fire teams work. And then we're also going to give you a basic tactics rundown on how to use fire maneuver tactics with your fire teams in your gangs of Necromunda, so that way you know exactly how to best use your fire teams on the tabletop and how to ensure victory for yourself each and every time. So that being said, let's go and start off with gang composition. So like I mentioned before, this video is a little bit more for brand new people to Necromunda, so that way we're going to talking about how your roles of your different fighters and what purposes they serve actually in your gang. So first of all, let's talk about leaders real quick. So when it comes to leaders, there's pretty much one of two ways you can look at how your leader will operate in your gang. You can either use them as a fighter or as a support character. Now usually when it comes down to using them as a fighter or for support, it pretty much depends on your personal preferences. As a player, are you more of a cautious player or you're more of a risk taker? Do you want your fighters to be engaged in the thick of it, or do you want to kind of hang back and just lead from the rear? It's pretty much up to you. Personally, I prefer to use my leaders as support characters just because if they die, there's no one else that can really replace their ranks. So I like to be a little bit more conservative in how I use my leaders, but then again, I've also ran into some people who actually use their leaders as the primary fighter for their gang, which makes total sense as well. And the reason why that is the case is because they usually have the best combat stats when it comes to your game. They usually have the really access to the best weapons and equipment. So that's why a lot of people like using them as fighters as well. So it's pretty much up to you what kind of role you want them to fulfill as your leader. Now, the second thing you need to worry about too, of course, is how leadership and group activations work when it comes to your gang leaders. Traditionally speaking, gang leaders can activate anywhere between 2 to 3 fighters per activation, depending if they have things like commanding presence as a skill, or if they have a cult icon or some kind of other special ability that allows them to have larger group activations. So because of their larger group activations, they're usually very important because they can have a lot of fighters fulfill different actions before your enemy gets activated next, which is also kind of important. At the same time, your leader also has a 12-inch range on giving cool tests to other fighters. So let's pretend, for example, one of your fighters is taking a nerf test. If they're within 12 inches of that leader, they can use the leader's cool test rather than their own, so they have a better chance of staying actually in the fight. At the same time, leadership skills are very key with this fighter on the leadership skill tree. But more often than not, you have to pass a leadership test of some sort to provide some kind of bonus, whether it's a mentor skill, giving additional leadership bonus experience gain to your guys' fighters, or if you're using overseer, for example. So if you're really into using those leadership skills, just be aware that the leader of your gang is probably the only one who's going to be able to use those quite effectively. Another key factor of your gang, of course, are your champions, and we're going to talk about exactly what role that they fulfill as well. Now, traditionally speaking, you're allowed to have up to maximum of 2 champions when you create a gang, unless, of course, you're playing other Aranthean Succession, for example, where you can double that number. We're just going to go with the assumption that you only can get 2 champions because you might just be a brand new player. Now, when it comes to champions, a big question that usually gets asked by new players is that do we use the champions as a fighter, or do we use them more of a support character, kind of like our leaders? Now, ideally, your champions are more of a fighter. That's pretty much what they're meant to do. Okay, the reason why is because usually their stats are a little bit better than normal fighters. They also usually get equipped with better close combat weapons or more powerful shooting attacks. So because of that, more often than not, you're going to use them as a fighter. Now, they can play the role of a support character because more often than not, your champion has better psychology stats than your actual fighters do, whether it's intelligence, willpower, leadership, or cool. So they do fulfill a support role in that they can also give some of their cool tests to some of their fighters, and so that's what they're really designed to do. These are kind of like your second command guys. Get them stuck in to fight alongside your fighters, so that way they can provide better fighting ability with their weapons and skills, and at the same time have some little buff with psychology as well. That's pretty much how you're going to do it with these guys. Now when it comes to leadership and group activations as well, traditionally speaking, champions can activate anywhere between 1 to 2 fighters, depending if there's any kind of game mechanic that increases their group activations. And just like their leader counterparts, they can also have cool tests within 6 inches. So for example, if you have a fighter who's taking a break test within 6 inches of your champion, they can use the champion's cool characteristic, which could be a little bit better, help them stay in the fighting for the most part. Now when it comes to your leader of your the skills for your champions, I like to have them focus more on fighting skills rather than leadership skills. The reason why that's the case is because leadership skills are usually secondary skills, which means your champion's probably never going to get access to those. So you want to make sure that they focus on fighting. They're not there to replace the leader in terms of leadership support. What they're really there to do is to add more killing power to your gang and also add a little bit of a buff for the psychology stats of some of your fighters. So let's talk about the rest of your fighters, which are your gangers, your juvies, as well as your prospects. So when it comes to your gangers and your prospects, these guys are the main killers in your gang. These guys are doing much of the fighting in your gang as well. More often than not, what you want to use these guys for is for your support fire team more often than not, and we'll talk about exactly what I mean by a support fire team. And the reason why is because they usually have better ballista skill, they have better fighting skills than their juvie as well as prospect counterparts. They also have better access to weapons. So more often than not, you're going to use your gangers to support your fighters with some longer range shooting in most cases, all right? Unless, of course, you're playing like a really close combat heavy type gang, then obviously you'll make them do close combat instead. Prospects, on the other hand, traditionally when you look at prospects, they're more like your traditional close quarters battle type of guys. You heard that term being thrown out a lot, which is CQB. CQB is acronym standing for close quarters battle, which means that these guys are fighting within short range shooting, so like anywhere under 12 inches, for example, or doing close combat for the most part. And that's how most prospects are actually kitted out in terms of the things they can do and the abilities that they have as well, right? They're meant for up close assaults in most cases. Now your juvies are actually kind of an interesting position. Your juvies are basically the youngest members of the gangs who are recruited in right off the streets. And when it comes to juvies, they're pretty much going to be used as your assault fire team elements. The reason why is because more often than not, juvies have CQB related weapons. Things like pistols and close combat weapons are probably the main gear that your juvies are going to be using. So because of that, you could use these guys on the assault more often than not. They actually gain their strength from actually charging in mass with several juvies engaging one fighter of quality on your enemy, for example. So that way they can get some bonuses for their close combat attacks and things of that nature. At the same time, you're going to pretty much use these guys as like human shields as well as bullet magnets. It may be horrible to say that, but that's pretty much what they're designed to do. Juvies live fast, furious, and they die young because you're going to put them in more risky situations that you wouldn't put your gangers, your prospectors, your champions, or leaders in. And the reason why is because juvies more often than not are very cheap in terms of recruitment, in terms of credits. If you lose a juvie, more often than not, you can just replace with a brand new one, so there's no harm or no foul for actually these guys being killed. Use them to protect your more valuable fighters or put them in engagements that are much more riskier than your normal fighters that you want to put in there. After all, they're cheap and expendable in most cases. Now I say most cases because you might play in a campaign where you can't recuperate your losses if you lose a fighter, so just keep that in mind. But I'm just kind of going with this video on the general idea that you're brand new Necromunda and you're looking for some useful tips to help you out. So up next is another question that I usually get from a lot of new players is, what should I focus on? Should I focus on the quantity of the fighters that I have in my gang, or should I focus on the quality of the fighters that I have in my gang? Now, traditionally speaking, depending on what kind of campaign you're going with, numbers usually, more often than not, are more important than the quality of fighters. So what do I mean by quality versus quantity? When I talk about what is more important, the number of fighters you have or the better equipment that your fighters have. Now, when you're first starting off, what you really want to do is focus on numbers. After all, the more fighters you have on the tabletop, the harder it is for your gang to be bottle tested off the tabletop, which means that if you fail a psychology test for a bottle test, your guys start retreating. So the more fighters you have, the more difficult it's going to be to force a bottle for your gang. So usually what you want to do is start off with more fighters than usual, and you just sort of start them off at bare bones. Usually give them a weapon of some sort, maybe some armor if you can afford it, but usually you're just kind of bare bonesing it for these guys for the most part. And the reason why is because at the early part of a campaign, if you lose fighters, they're very easy to replace. You just hire another fighter that type that you lost. No harm, no foul. Now, as for the quality aspect of your fighters develops as the campaign progresses, because as you earn more income, as your fighters gain experience, they will become better at their fighting abilities, they'll learn skills, they'll learn better stats, and they'll have access to better weapons, armor, and war gear as the campaign continues. And that's when you start focusing on the quality aspect, because you want to have a large kind of number of base fighters in your game to make it more survivable, and as they become more seasoned and more veteran, then they can become more deadly in terms of weapons and equipment that they have, as well as the skills that they developed. So that's pretty much how it goes in there. Now, that's what I'm talking about traditionally speaking. Obviously, if you're playing in a Ranthine Succession, which is a little bit different, you want to focus on quality versus quantity, because you can't recuperate your losses in a Ranthine Succession campaign. But for most of you guys out there who are just starting out playing in Dominion campaigns, usually want to go for quantity of your fighters, and then you can focus on quality as your campaign develops. So now that we're done talking about your basics of game compositions, let's talk about fire teams and how you will be using them in your games of Necromunda. Now, what is a fire team? Let's go and start about that first of all. What you need to realize is that your gang in Necromunda, if you were to take this gang that you're playing, and if you're to apply into like a real world military type situation, it would basically be considered a squad of soldiers, right? Squads of soldiers are anywhere between 10 to 15 soldiers, traditionally speaking, and what they do with a squad is they break this squad down into smaller sections that they call a fire team. A fire team is usually anywhere between half to a third of a squad's normal fighting prowess, okay? And when you think of it that way, thinking of your game in Necromunda as a squad level engagement between two different squads and breaking them down to smaller fire teams, it's a little bit easier to understand how basically to use it. Now, if you are kind of confused, don't stress out, because I will have strip maps I'm going to be showing you here in a second to show you exactly what role these fire teams fulfill. So traditionally speaking, when you divide your gang into smaller sections or into fire teams, you basically have two major roles when it comes to creating your fire teams, all right? You have what I like to call support fire teams and assault fire teams. Those are two categories I like to use. If you watch any of my videos before when I talk about gang compositions, I could use gangs on the tabletop. This is usually what I'm referring to. Now, what does a support fire team do? A support fire team is responsible for suppressing your enemy and engaging the enemy at distance. What I mean by suppression is, you see this all the time in movies. You'll see a character say, hey, to his friend, give me some cover, and his friend just starts blasting his weapon directly at the enemy. What does that character do when that happens? The bad guy is being shot at basically ducks down behind cover because they want to be killed. And the reason why you're doing that is because you are suppressing your enemy by unleashing large amounts of fire at your enemy and hopefully pinning enemies or trying to keep them hiding from cover. It allows your other friends to maneuver around the battlefield in order to engage the enemy and destroy them. Okay, that's pretty much how suppression pretty much works. And that is exactly what your support fire team does. What you're going to do is you're going to equip these guys with longer range weapons, either heavy weapons or suppression type weapons, things like missile launchers, for example, heavy stubbers, plasma guns, auto guns, last guns, longer range weapons, what you're going to use these guys for. The idea is supposed to be that the support fire teams puts fire directly at your enemy. Hopefully you can hit some people and kill them. That would be like the greatest thing ever. But if you can't do that, you could pin your enemies so that way you can take away their activations. Alright, so you want to focus on that. That's what their whole role is. The second role is what I like to call an assault fire team. Now, the assault fire team's responsibility is for closing the distance with the enemy and finishing them off in close quarters battle, also known as CQB is what it's also known as. Alright. These are the guys who are assaulting directly towards the enemy, engaging them in close combat, or shooting at them in point blank, short range distances. Okay. Traditionally speaking, when you equip these guys, you want to equip them with close range weapons, such as melee weapons, for example, pistols, shotguns, any weapon that has anywhere between I would say 15 inches or less in terms of range for weaponry, because traditionally speaking, their short range are very powerful. Grenades would also be considered part of assault fire team's equipment range. So these guys are the ones who get up close and personal when it comes to their fighting and causing damage. So now that we're done talking about exactly how a fire team works, let's go and show you an example of what this will look like on the tabletop. Alright, so here's a small little strip map that I made for you guys to demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fire teams real quick. So the orange box on this map represents your enemy. And as you can see here, we're basically taking our gang and we divide it into two basic fire teams. Half the gang will be considered a support fire team, and half of the gang will be considered an assault fire team. Now, ideally how you want to do this is you want to square up against your opponent with your support fire team and then put your assault fire team either left or right of your support fire team, whichever has the best and fastest avenue of approach directly towards your enemy, so that way they can flank your enemy quickly. Okay, and this is pretty much how you would deploy your fighters if you use a basic fire team model. So if you're to engage with your enemy using the fire maneuver tactics being demonstrated here with your fire team, the support fire team, the first thing it does is opens fire at longer ranges with its weapons, whether it's auto guns, last guns, bolt guns, heavy weapons, whatever the case may be. They're now shooting at the enemy as represented by that red arrow. While they're shooting at the enemy, if your opponent is smart anyways, he's taking cover so that way none of his guys get shot. If any of you guys get shot and not killed right off the bat, they are pinned, which means they lose one of their active actions during their activation to get back on their feet again, which will then also limit your enemy's ability to do anything on the battlefield. Now, while your support fire team is opening fire on the enemy or suppressing them, what ends up happening is your assault fire team then begins to flank, meaning they're heading towards a side that is exposed to being attacked from, right? That's basically what a flank is. Now, as you can see in this example, the assault fire team has maneuvered to the left-hand side, going perpendicular to your enemy formation, as represented by that blue arrow, seeing as they're moving up forward and then sweeping over to the left-hand side to flank your enemy. And that's pretty much how that would work there in fire maneuver. Now, continuing on this situation, going real basic here, what ends up happening is that the assault fire team then becomes engage the enemy, right? So what that's known as is close quarters battle with the assault fire team. Either the assault fire team is actually charging the enemy in close combat and fighting them in close combat, or they're shooting at them at short to medium ranges, or whatever the case may be, they're now attacking the enemy. And as you can see here, now they're stuck in this kind of like crossfire where they're being shot at not just from the front by the support fire team, but also from the left-hand side by the assault fire team as well. And that's pretty much how it's supposed to operate. That way you have twice as much firepower going directly to the enemy. They're hitting at two different angles, so that way they divide their attention between multiple fire teams, and that's pretty much how it's supposed to operate. Now, there might be a situation where, let's say for example, your assault fire team is flanking your enemy, but now your enemy decides to put all their effort against your assault fire team, not putting as much effort on your support fire teams. The question then becomes, what do you do then? The nice thing about fire team tactics is that if your enemy decides to focus on one of your other fire teams, the other fire team can then act as a support or an assault fire team wherever the situation may warrant. For example, the assault fire team in this example is being forced to become a support fire team, shooting at the enemy formation, and because the avenue of approach or the movement that the support fire team can take towards the enemy is open, they charge forward and now engage your enemy. In this case, you're mobbing your enemy and attacking on two different fronts, and you can finish off your opponents in close combat. And that's pretty much how fire teams are supposed to operate on the tabletop. Now, when it comes to fighters, individual fighters in your fire teams, what you want to do is kind of space out your fighters between each other. Traditionally speaking, you want to keep everyone at least 3 inches away from each other. Now, the reason why you want to do that is for a couple of reasons. One, if you're 3 inches away between enemy fighters, you're got just enough space to escape any 3-inch blast weapons or template weapons that your opponent may have. So for example, let's pretend that your opponent throws a frag grenade and hits one of your fighters. There's still about 1.5 inches space between the edge of that blast template to your next fighter, so that they were protected. Or if an enemy gets hit, if your enemy takes a template weapon like a flamer, for example, and hits some of your guys, there's just enough space to make sure that only one guy gets hit by the flamer template, and not all the time. So that's the reason why I want to keep at least 3 inches away from each of your fighters. Now, I do really understand that the situation might change where you not be able to do that. If that happens, of course, whatever happens on the tabletop, you adjust to it. But the idea is supposed to be you want that 3 inches, so that way they're far enough away where they're not getting killed by blasts and template weapons, but they're still close enough to give quick assistance to one of your fighters if something should happen. At the same time, when it comes to keeping your fighters in a fire team, you want to pair off your fighters, or what are called like battle buddies, we like to call about it. In the military, you hear people saying this all the time. They call it your battle buddy. The idea is supposed to be that if you're ever in a situation where you're not back at garrison, or if you're out in the field operating, or if you're out fighting, the idea is supposed to be that no soldier should be alone. And that makes sense because you're in hostile territory. You want to always have backup. If anything should happen to you, you want to have a buddy to help you out in case something should happen. It works in real life, and it also works on the tabletop as well. You do want to pair off your fighters into battle buddies, because that way, if any of these kind of conditions happen to one of your fighters, their buddy can help them out. For example, if one of your fighters gets hit with a blaze attack and they get actually hit on fire, you can actually have a battle buddy give you +1 for your blaze test to help them out if they're within 1 inch of that fighter. Or if one of your fighters gets injured, for example, they can provide medical assistance for injuries within 1 inch, which basically means if you roll an injury die, you get to re-roll it and take the better of the two options. And at the same time, if any one of your fighters gets engaged in close combat, they have another buddy that can back them up in close combat with assists and interferences, so that way your enemy can't successfully injure your fighter. So battle buddies is a good way to use on the tabletop. It works in real life. And with that being said, let me show you exactly what this would look like if you're to put this on the tabletop. So going back to our strip map instructions here, this is an example of what I'm talking about when you have your battle buddies and how you want to organize your guys in fire teams. As you can see, we have 4 fighters represented by blue circles, and those little double arrow lines represent that these fighters are about 3 inches away from each other. So that way they're all separated on their own. That way if a blast template weapon lands on them, they'll still be okay. At the same time as well, you also have your leader or your champion, which is the character here in the bottom, who's also got this red circle here, and that's supposed to represent that that's an area that the leader or champion's influence has over the squad, over this fire team. For example, a champion, everybody should be within 6 inches of the champion, so that way if they have to take psychology tests, they can benefit from that. Or if the leader is leading this fire team, they could activate guys within 12 inches, so that way they could use that for their psychology stats as well. And this is pretty much how you kind of want to organize your fighters. All of them within 3 inches of each other, but the larger fire team within 6 to 12 inches, depending on who's leading that fire team, whether it's a champion or a leader. And that's pretty much how your fighters should look on the tabletop when you organize them as well. So in conclusion, when it comes to gang composition, remember what role your fighters play within your gang, whether they're leaders, champions, gangers, juvies, or prospects. Remember exactly what role they fulfill in your gang and equip them accordingly as well. Also, when it comes to building your very first gang, focus on quantity, meaning getting as many fighters as you can in your gang for the credit limit that you have, and of course, quality for your fighters will develop as your campaign develops as well. Also remember, when it comes to fire teams, to divide up your gang into support as well as assault fire teams, and equip those fire teams accordingly. Make sure that you also maintain the spacing between fighters as well, so that way they can not worry about being group killed by any single weapon, but at the same time close enough that they can lend each other assistance if they need to. And also remember their battle buddy system as well, so that way they can get the psychological benefits of their champions as well as the leaders as well. So there you guys have it. This is my basics when it comes to gang compositions, regardless of what gang you play. And if you're brand new to Necromunda, I hope that this helps you out, so that way you can start playing in your games in this wonderful campaign setting. That's good for this one, guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.